So our next speaker is Andrea Watson. Andrea is the Research Assistant Professor in the Animal Science Department of UNL. The areas of research that she's involved in includes protein utilization and metabolism, as well as nutrient cycling through agriculture systems. She's the coordinator of the online minor in beef cattle nutrition through the Masters of Applied Science degree. And so, Andrea, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Usually they let me go in front of you instead of following up behind you, so I've got my work cut out for me today. I do want to say a special thank you first. A lot of work has gone into this, and most of it was not done by me. So most of what I'm presenting is other people's work, but especially Henry Hilscher, who's a PhD student right now at UNL. A lot of work has been done by him. So he has been living corn silage for the last 2 years. I've just been thinking about it for the last month, 2 months or something. He's been living it for 2 years. A lot of the pictures that you see that I'm using, that we've used on the brochure and things, Henry took those over the last couple of years. And then the other student would be Colt Noni, sitting right down here in front, telling me if I do something wrong. His master's work is going to be on corn silage as well. So he's put a lot of work, especially into some of the lab procedures that I'll be presenting. So really today I'm going to talk about growing diets, so corn silage and growing diets. And the whole idea here is corn silage a good feed resource to use in growing diets? Now if you don't want to pay attention for the next 25 minutes or so, yes. The answer is yes, it's a great feed resource, but protein is the key to getting those really good performance with corn silage. So now I'm going to step you through quite a few performance studies that we've done, why we think corn silage works well, and what sort of protein you need to use. So the first trial goes back a little bit, Jeff Fulmer's data. You can tell him his data is alive and well if you see him. So it was a 90% corn silage diet, so growing calves, about 90% corn silage in this diet. The remaining would have been a supplement. This supplement was composed primarily of soybean meal and urea, so pretty degradable sources of protein. Now, some of the previous speakers, or all morning, we've been talking about quality of silage. And so I'm not really talking about quality of silage, but on my slides I've tried to point out the dry matter of the silage and the crude protein content of each of these silages, just so you can kind of have an idea of what kind of silages these were in each of these trials. So 16 pins of cattle, 101-day growing trial. They did get an implant in this trial. As you can see, initial body weights, so those calves came on to feed at about 600 pounds. They then went off of feed at about 900 pounds. I feel like I'm talking with my back to some of you here. And they ate over 18.5 pounds per day. So they had pretty good intakes, gains approaching 3 pounds per day, and feed conversions of 6.3. I think this is pretty good for a growing diet, 90% corn silage, but I think we can do better. A couple of trials here. I'm going to do 2 trials, actually, one at Ohio State and one at the University of Illinois. So this first one looks at corn silage, so 3 different diets. Corn silage locked in at 79% of the diet, and then urea at 1.4, or distillers grains at 18.3%, or soybean meal at 9.2% of the diet. So 3 different diets, 3 different types of protein supplementation, but all 3 diets had the same amount of crude protein. So different types of protein, but crude protein in those diets was about the same. Important here, the undegradable protein portion of those diets. So 26.8, the highest amount of undegradable protein would be in the distillers' diets, and then a little bit lower with your soybean meal diets. What did that do to performance? So these were 84 days on a growing trial. We had about 8 pins on each of the different treatments. Calves were just short of 600 pounds going on to the trial and came off between 840 and 890 pounds. Cattle gained between 2.9 and 3.45 pounds per day. A pretty good spread between those 3 different treatments. Dry matter intake was not statistically different between the 3 treatments. Feed to gain really puts it all together for you. So this distillers grains diet, 18% distillers, and essentially the remainder of the diet being corn silage, converted at 4.7. The soybean meal, very similar, so intakes and gain similar, and the conversion very, very similar, but the economics with this, the soybean meal obviously would have been quite a bit more expensive than the distillers grains. And then finally the urea diet, converting at about 5.3. Now, the follow-up question to this study would be, can you just increase the amount of urea in the diet and get enough crude protein that you don't have to feed a bypass protein source? Can you feed urea and not have to worry about feeding distillers grains? So they had 3 levels of urea here, 90% corn silage, and just increasing the amount of urea in the diet. So you can see here, 12.9% crude protein, all the way up to about 15.5% crude protein. RUP is actually decreasing as a percent of crude protein. Performance, so about 86 days on feed for these calves, only 3 pins for each of the treatments. Initial body weights, a little bit over 400 pounds. Final body weights, 630 up to 680 pounds. Average daily gain, dry matter intake, and feed to gain all linearly decreased as you increase the amount of urea in the diet. So we actually got poorer performance by increasing the amount of urea in these diets. So absolutely no, you cannot just increase the amount of urea in these diets and expect to get as good a performance as, say, distillers grains or soybean meal or some of these bypass protein products. Which brings us to a trial that Barry Weber did. So this was some hybrid work, different corn hybrids. I'm not going to present that part of it. I'm just going to present the main effect here of including distillers grains in the diet. So he had an 80% silage, 15% wet distillers grains in his diet. Again, dry matter of the silage, crude protein of the diet's about 13%. We thought these calves actually did pretty good. So 20 pins of cattle, 86 days on this diet. You can see they come on to the diet about 600 pounds, and they went off just short of 925 pounds. They ate really well, almost 21 pounds per day that they were eating, gains of 3.6, so over 3.5 pounds per day gain on a growing diet. Feed conversions of 5.75. So this is quite a bit better than back when we were doing a soybean meal urea blend and we included distillers grains instead. What did that do? Initial body weights are very similar. Ending body weights are very similar, but they were on feed for 86 fewer days when we had this distillers grains diet in order to get the same pounds of gain. Dry matter intake was increased when we had that distillers grains in the diet. Average daily gain went up over half a pound a day compared to the soybean meal urea supplementation. Feed conversions were down by 0.5, 0.6. Crude, so why is this all happening? That's really the question. Crude protein was up a little bit, so we went from 12.4% crude protein up to about 13% with the distillers grains diet. But really what was changing is the amount of RUP in these diets. So the rumen undegradable protein, or the bypass protein in these diets, increased by about 5.5 percentage units, going from a soybean meal urea supplement to a distillers grain supplement, which took us down this whole path then of how much RUP do these calves need. In a growing diet, what are the metabolizable protein requirements of these calves, and how much RUP should we be supplementing? So we did a couple of trials here in the iBarn. So this is our individual fed barn just down the road. We did 60 steers at a time. It was actually, this first trial would be Henry's trial at the 2x5 factorial, but I'm only going to talk about the 5 levels of RUP supplementation. 78 days, and all got a Rowgrow implant. So the base diet is 88% corn silage with 12% supplement. That supplement is either an RUP supplement or an RDP supplement. So either a bypass supplement or a supplement that's degraded in the rumen. The RUP supplement consists of soy pass and imperial, both, mostly those 2 ingredients. Those of you that are from Nebraska or been around, you know what soy pass is probably. And then, so it's a product of soybeans. It's a soybean protein. Imperial would be a corn product, so it actually comes out of the Blair Cargill plant. Both are high in protein as well as high in bypass protein. The RDP supplement then is almost entirely made up of soybean hulls and urea. So for our different diets, all diets had 88% corn silage in them, and then we just layered in these 2 supplements. So at the 0 treatment level, we have no RUP, and at the 10 treatment level, we have 12% of the RUP supplement, different combinations of those as you go across. Crude protein of the diet is going from 11% down here at the 0 level all the way up to 13.5%. RUP in the diet just coming from the supplement. So if we ignore the RUP coming from the silage and only take into account that RUP that's coming from the supplement, it goes from 0.5% of the diet all the way up to 4.2% of the diet. What does performance look like? So calves, again, they were about 600 pounds when they went on, and anywhere from 791 all the way up to 868 pounds when they came off. Average daily gain and feed to gain linearly improved as we increased the RUP in the diet. So average daily gain of 2.5 pounds per day all the way up to 3.43. When we designed the trial, we were expecting a quadratic response. So we thought we'll go all the way up here to this 10% treatment, this 4.2% RUP in the diet. We'll see a nice quadratic response. We'll know exactly how much RUP we need in the diet. That didn't happen. So if you graph average daily gain, you can see that as we go from the 0 amount of RUP supplement up to the 5% treatment level, we increased average daily gain almost 32%. As you go beyond that, we only saw an improvement of about 3.6%. So it kind of looks quadratic. We're thinking maybe there's a break point, we just weren't able to pick it up statistically. We stick to the statistics, linear improvement. Let's repeat the study, do a little bit higher level of RUP supplementation. So Colton Oney followed it up with another iBarn study, so another group of 60 steers, another set of 5 levels of RUP supplementation, but a little bit different levels now, going up to 13% of the diet. This was an 83-day trial. So here's his diets, 85% corn silage now, so we had to drop the corn silage level a little bit so that we could increase this amount of supplement. 15% of either the RUP or the RDP supplement. Same supplements, either soy pass and imperial, or this time, fine ground corn and urea instead of the soybean hulls. So the actual diets, you can see here we blended the 2 types of supplements as you go across. So you go from 15% RDP supplement to 15% RUP supplement. Crude protein is increasing, so 11.5% crude protein down here at the low end, all the way up to almost 15% at the high end. RUP is really what we're looking at. So the amount of bypass protein just from the supplement goes from 0.4, which will match up with Henry's data, all the way up to 5.5% of the diet. Again, this time we've certainly got enough RUP in there. Surely we'll see a quadratic response. Once again, we saw a linear response. So we're still linearly improving average daily gain as we increase that RUP in the diet. So the first 3 treatments here, we saw an improvement of about 11% in average daily gain as we increased. And then from the middle all the way up to the high level of RUP, we saw an additional 12.5% improvement. So this one really does look pretty linear. One interesting thing that came out of this study would be we took interim body weight. About halfway through the trial, we weighed the calves a couple consecutive days. And here I have feed to gain on the bottom in the red. This would be feed to gain for the first 37 days of the trial. On the top would be feed to gain for the last 40 days or so of the trial. We really saw a response to that additional RUP in the diet the first 40 days of the trial. So we saw almost a 31% improvement in feed to gain that first chunk of the trial, first month and another week on the trial. The last 40 days, only about 0.6% improvement in feed to gain by having that extra RUP in the diet. So requirements are certainly changing throughout the feeding period. If we look at his total, all 83 days on feed, you can see initial body weights, 600 pounds. Dry matter intake, no differences across treatments. Average daily gain going from 2.4 pounds per day, linearly increasing up to just over 3 pounds per day. Feed to gain, a 14.3% improvement as you go from 0 RUP supplement at 6.5 all the way down here to 5.5, essentially with the 13% treatment. Now, if we put both trials together, so both iBarn trials, Henry and Colton's data, I went ahead and combined them. If we look strictly at statistics, It is a linear response with the two of them. If you look at it graphically, there's kind of a break point there. I went ahead and graphed it out. If you believe that's really a quadratic response, this is maximized at 7. If we had a treatment at 7%, that would be the maximum point on that quadratic line. If you, in fact, think it's linear, I've got both on here. So if you think it's quadratic and that we're kind of maximizing average daily gain right here, that would be with 3.2% RUP provided by the supplement. What does that mean? That would be similar to feeding about 15.6% distillers grains in a corn silage diet. If you think it's linear and you can really improve performance by maximizing the amount of RUP in the diet, the highest level that we fed was 4.6% RUP, which would be similar to just over 27% distillers grains in the diet. So somewhere between 15 and 27% distillers in the diet with corn silage. I'd say all of those give you really good performance. Again, these calves were gaining over 3 pounds per day when we got up to the higher levels of RUP supplementation. But really the question is, why did they keep linearly improving average daily gain instead of quadratic response or tailing off? So we went to the NRC model. We were using the 1996 NRC model to predict metabolizable protein requirements as well as supply of metabolizable protein to these calves. So here I've got 3 different trials. I've got in the squares is the second half of Colton's trial. The circles, the red circles, are going to be the first half of that trial when their requirements were really high. And then the triangles are Henry's trial where he didn't feed quite as much RUP. So here we have average daily gain, and along the bottom we have metabolizable protein balance. So that's simply how much was supplied minus how much they required. So right here is balance. This is we supplied as much MP as the cattle required, at least what we're predicting. You can see only one of Henry's treatments is past that line, so that's a plus 30 grams per day metabolizable protein. So one of his treatments actually met metabolizable protein requirements. With Colton's data, the red, again, that's the first 35, 40 days on feed. Only one of his treatments supplied an excess of metabolizable protein, while the second to highest level just barely met protein requirements. If you look at the second half of his trial, so the last 40 days on feed or so, 2 of the treatments now are at least meeting metabolizable protein requirements. So even this data would suggest that we probably should have still seen a quadratic response, at least in Colton's data. But if you take it a step further and predict lysine requirements, now we see something pretty interesting. Again, using the 96 NRC model, my legend is the same, so still the 3 trials basically. And here, so right here is what we would predict that we supplied exactly how much lysine those calves need, right at the 0 level. Now for Henry and the first 40 days of Colton's trial, both of those were just barely meeting lysine requirements. The second half of Colton's trial, now the top 2 treatments have met lysine requirements. And right here I've got, so the second half of Colton's trial, he would have needed about a 9% treatment in order to meet lysine requirements, while the first 40 days on feed, he would have actually needed an 11.2% treatment in order to meet lysine requirements. So fairly high lysine requirements for these really young growing calves. And it really comes down to the law of the first limiting nutrient, and it's really, really important that we know what that nutrient might be. It doesn't matter if you're building a house and you run out of nails, you're baking a cake and you run out of baking soda, or you're trying to grow cattle and you run out of a nutrient, whether that's an amino acid or energy or a mineral, whatever it is, you're really going to limit productivity. And so it's important that we know what those requirements are and what we're supplying. Which brings me to a little bit of a tangent here, but the new NRC, as Dan Lloyd just pointed out, the 2016 NRC is out. Those of you that are nutritionists in the room, I'm sure are really excited about that. I just want to point out one thing that has changed, which really affects growing diets specifically. So if you compare the 96 NRC to the 2016 NRC, microbial efficiency predictions have changed a little bit. So in the 96 NRC, the default value, if you will, is 13% microbial efficiency. And they recommend 11.5% microbial efficiency if you're feeding a silage diet. So some of those fermentable energy, some of the energy that would have been used in the rumen has already been used during the silage fermentation process, so we drop microbial efficiency a little bit in those silage diets. The 2016 NRC now actually uses an equation, which I have here, to predict microbial crude protein yield. Now at the Husker Nutrition Conference back in November, so a few months ago, Terry and I talked about this quite a bit. We put together a 13 growing trial summary to test the two different NRCs basically and see what that would do to our calculations and our recommendations. Comes up with, these 13 trials averaged about 35% silage in the diet. So the 96 NRC recommended that microbial efficiency was about 12.5%, while the new NRC came up with a value of about just short of 10%. What does that do? What does that mean? So here I've graphed metabolizable protein supply. So how much MP is being supplied to those calves as predicted by the NRC relative to gain. So red diamonds are the 96 NRC, and the gray circles are the new NRC, the 2016 NRC. You can see the new NRC decreased our prediction of metabolizable protein supply by 16%. So this dotted gray line is 16% below the dashed red line. Requirements have not changed. So this is metabolizable protein requirements for these calves, no matter which NRC you use, that hasn't changed. So this really matters for these calves right here. So these calves, using the new NRC, would be predicted to be MP deficient. The same calves, but using the 96 NRC, are predicted to have just enough to have met metabolizable protein requirements using the old NRC. So it's something to keep in mind when you're formulating rations. If you have a nutritionist that's formulating rations, it's very important to know what the microbial efficiency is and if you're meeting those requirements or not. Again, like Dan Loy said, these models are only as good as the numbers that you put in, so you have to make sure you know what you're putting in. A number that will be important if you're predicting metabolizable protein supply is the RUP content of corn silage. It's not as straightforward as you might think. Corn silage is a blend of forages and concentrates, and usually most of our lab procedures are for either forages or concentrates. So trying to measure this in a blended product is a little more challenging. Our best guess right now is that the RUP content of corn silage is about 22% of the crude protein. So not quite a quarter of the protein in silage is actually RUP, or undegradable in the rumen. So that means quite a bit of it is degradable. This is because the corn within the corn silage is actually quite wet. So corn silage, we've been talking a lot about the moisture at which corn silage is harvested. It's important because the corn kernels within that corn silage are kind of like high moisture corn. And as that silage ferments, or it's in the bunker, the kernels actually absorb some of the moisture from the forage. So that forage is quite wet when you chop it and put it in the bunk. Here we have two different dry matter silages, and you can see that we took out the corn kernels from that silage after it's been in the bunker and tested their dry matter. The drier the corn silage, the drier the kernels, or the wetter the corn silage, the wetter the kernels. This matters because Josh Benton put together this nice review, and we're working to update it now. The wetter the corn kernels are, the less RUP content there is in the grain. So here we have about 28% moisture corn, 30% moisture corn, and 35% moisture corn. So the corn keeps getting wetter and day of ensiling. So the longer you ensile that corn and the wetter it is, whether it's high moisture corn or corn within corn silage, you keep decreasing the amount of RUP in that corn. So a lot of the RUP would have been coming from the grain, but if you've ensiled this or it's a wet corn, you're actually taking away some of that RUP, which is still good feed, but you have to make sure that you account for that when you're formulating diets in. So take-home messages would be that these smaller calves, if you're doing growing diets, before they get to 700 pounds, that first 40 days on the growing diet maybe, their requirements are quite high. It's important that we always formulate diets to meet their requirements every single day and not on average throughout the whole feeding period. So their requirements are going to be highest on day 1, it's important that we meet the requirements on day one. Distillers grains is the crude protein in distillers grains is about 63% RUP. So it is an excellent source of RUP to be fed with corn silage. But remember, if you're feeding corn silage and distillers grains, both of those are corn proteins. And so if you're feeding all corn, lysine is going to be your first limiting amino acid if one is limiting. And so it's just something to keep in mind and check to see if you're limited there or not. And then, of course, the longer you ensile corn silage, or the wetter it is, the lower the RUP content is of your corn silage. Any RUP that you might have then is probably coming from the forage. Forages traditionally have less than 50% digestibility of that RUP. So any RUP that is there may not actually be available to the animal. So the bottom line is that corn silage is an excellent feed, as long as we make sure that we formulate for metabolizable protein and keep in mind that we might have some limiting amino acids. And with that, I guess I have a question slide too, if anybody has questions.
So what questions do you have for Andrea? Oh, yeah.
Why did you choose a Ralco implant and you use TBA without changing your requirements?
Okay, so the question is about the implant program, actually, that we use. So in a lot of these, we used a Ralco implant. I can't say the exact philosophy behind using the Ralco, but I do know definitely what implant you're going to use will change your requirements, certainly. So that's something else that you need to keep into the back of your mind. What implant am I using? What kind of gains am I expecting to make sure that you formulate for those kinds of things? So we were thinking of Ralco, probably a fairly short growing period here, a fairly short trial, and then probably following it up with another trial before they actually went on to a finishing period. So we were probably going to do several implants before we actually got to a finishing period, is my guess on why we were doing a Ralco.
Other questions? Here.
Yeah, the decrease in RUP that you saw, was that related to the decrease in zinc proteins that we see in the corn silage then?
Yes, so the question is relative to the RUP content of the grain that we see in corn silage, it's exactly related to the Zen protein in the fermentation process. So as that gets broken down while it's in the bunker during that fermentation process, that absolutely makes it more rumen degradable.
So it would also probably be related to the increased digestibility of the starch as well.
Yes, so at the same time that you're having increased protein degradability, you're also having increased digestion of the starch in the rumen. Those two go hand in hand. As the starch becomes more available in that corn kernel, the protein also becomes more available. Yeah.
How did the cost of gain behave in those factorial trials? Was it also linear?
So the question is cost of gain in the two iBarn trials where we were looking at increasing the amount of RUP supplementation. We have not done economics necessarily with it. It really depends on what you're using for your RUP source. I can't say I haven't done economics with it to know. It really depends what you're paying for your corn silage versus how you can get your RUP source bought. If it's distillers grains, if you're having to use a different source, and really how do you value your corn silage, which is Terry's talk. I don't want to steal his thunder. How do you value your corn silage? What is the price that you put on it? It's a lot of discussion. I think will come up here in another hour or so.
Andrea,
Yes, Rick.
if you were using distillers grains, in particular wet distillers grains, as your RUP source, you're also changing the energy content of the diet. And how does that then change the amino acid the RUP need?
Absolutely. So as Rick pointed out, we were using wet distillers grains in these diets. We're increasing the energy content of these diets, which increases gain. As you increase gain, you keep increasing the requirement for RUP. So is it a never-ending circle? We keep chasing our tail trying to get enough RUP. Terry has a comment.
And you may not add much lysine, so lysine may become even more limited.
Every time you increase distillers grains, you're not necessarily bringing any lysine into the diet, we're really depending on microbial crude protein production for any lysine because the distiller's grains is bringing in so little. And so we can really get some pretty good gains. I'd say we were over 3.5 pounds per day on some of these, but we're probably still limited on some of that metabolizable protein.
Andrea, can I follow up on that?
Yes.
So should we be balancing for lysine on diets where all the feedstuffs come from the corn plant?
I think we should be taking it into consideration. So the new NRC is out. It does not balance for amino acids. The dairy side of things, they're really starting to concentrate on amino acids and making sure they're meeting amino acid requirements. I think that's a direction that we're headed to. I think it's something we need to start thinking about all the time, especially in diets here where we're really depending on corn for all of our protein. Lysine could potentially be an issue. I'd really like to do a trial before I hang my hat on this and say lysine's going to give you a boost in performance. I don't know that, and I think that's something we're really interested in testing.
One more.
Are you being decreased in all in-silage processes, like triticale, wheat, anything else that have a higher protein content?
Absolutely. So the question is about other, not corn silage, but triticale, maybe your rye silages, same process. So during this fermentation process, as the feed becomes more digestible, the protein also becomes more degradable, more rumen available, so you're decreasing the RUP content of that feed. Yep.
Okay, let's thank Andrea.
Very good.